Hello everyone, my name is Peter Clements. Thank you for listening to my presentation. My topic is Storying the Methods class, and what this means is I'm going to talk about a teaching methods class that I teach for people who are getting an English teacher's license. And I'm going to talk about how I've used some techniques from narrative inquiry to encourage students to reflect on the course and also to reflect on their future careers as potential teachers. So let's get started. So here is a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with a little bit of my own interest in narrative and some of the research that I've done, and also some of the theoretical assumptions that I think are pretty important here. And then I'm going to talk about two activities that I've been using in my methods course. The first is called narrative frames, and the second is short story analysis. And I've been using these. Not all aspects of these activities are field tested. Some of them I'm still working on. So I'll try to note that as I go along. Okay, so a little bit about my own research. I've been doing research involving pre-service teachers. These are Japanese university students who are getting teacher's licenses, many of them planning to be teachers in the future, and some of them planning to be English teachers. And I first did an analysis of some published practicum narratives. These were students' accounts that were published in a university pamphlet and used narrative analysis to examine some of the commonalities across those narratives and the things that the students considered important in their experience. And then I followed that up with an interview study of 3 pre-service teachers before and after their final practicum session in their final year of university. And this was kind of a nice complement to the first study because it was more of an anonymous situation rather than written public account. And those were interviews, so they were not necessarily in narrative form, but I used narrative analysis to look at what they considered the most important aspects of their experience and how they put their experience together into a whole story. And most recently, I've been working with short story analysis and looking at some extracts from the interviews from the previous study, and I'm going to say more about short story analysis later on, so I won't say more about that here. And next, a little bit about theory. Narrative inquiry, which I'm talking about here, is not really a theory with a capital T. It's more like a set of methodological tools. But those tools definitely go better with certain types of studies and certain theories than others. So I want to point out a few things. Donald Polkinghorne, who has written a lot about narrative inquiry in social science research, makes 2 important points. One is that narratives and stories are retrodictive but not predictive. That is, narratives look back on an experience and they try to make sense of it and do things like puzzle out cause and effect and assign significance and decide which details are important and which aren't. But that does not say anything about what will happen in the future. So that makes narrative inquiry more appropriate to qualitative studies rather than quantitative studies that might be trying to use statistical procedures to predict how people will act in the future. He also says that narratives are constantly being reworked and remade, which means that any given narrative is never the last word on an experience. It is always open to being added to and changed and sometimes even completely rewritten. So there's kind of a dynamic element of narrative. And then Gary Barkhazen, who has built on Polkinghorne's work in a lot of his own work, has two further points. Narratives are situated and co-constructed. That is, people tell their stories in particular places and in response to particular situations. And those stories are co-constructed by the people who hear the stories. The best example of this is when I'm interviewing my Japanese students. The stories that they tell me are in response to my questions and to my reactions. So the stories are not just theirs, they are co-constructed by the person telling the story and by me, the listener. Also, stories and narratives are a process of making meaning. They aren't a product. They are the actual process itself. They are the way that people figure out what is meaningful about their experiences and what's important. All right, so next I'm going to talk about two activities that I've been using in my methods course. By the way, this course is kind of a capstone course. It's the last of a series that the students in the department I work in take. But it also has students from other departments as well, so not everybody has taken the same sequence of courses. So anyway, I look at the course as kind of a conclusion to a lot of the work that they've done at the university. So I've used these activities to try to get them to reflect on the course itself and on their futures as potential teachers. But I should add that not everybody in the course is planning to be a teacher. So anyway, the first activity that I use is called narrative frames. And a narrative frame is a series of prompts that scaffold the writing of a story. I've put an example of a narrative frame that I use in my handout. And if you can see that, you'll see that the prompts can include sentence starters as well as connectors and modifiers with lots of blank space and lines around those elements so that students can fill in their own content. And a narrative frame focuses on a story, which is usually a specific event within the writer's experience. In this case, the narrative frame focuses on the class itself. So the story is the story of the class and the course. If you are interested in seeing what other researchers have done with narrative frames and other teachers have done, you can check out Barkhazen and Hiratsuka for some more examples. Narrative frames can be used in lots of different ways. In my course, I use what I call a before-after narrative frame, which is a first day narrative frame about the student's expectations, and that's the one that's on the handout. And then a last day narrative frame about how those expectations were realized. So on the first and last day of class, they fill out these narrative frames, which are sort of two parts of a whole. The prompts on these frames are parallel. So the first day frame has one that goes, I expect to learn. And then the last day frame has a prompt that goes, I learned. Okay, so they have to think about what they're expecting from the course on the first day, and then on the last day they have to look at how those expectations were realized. And I preface this activity with a small group discussion. This is most important on the first day when students are all new to the course. And I basically just give them the questions that are on the frame and have them talk about those questions in groups. And this is very important because it helps them to understand the prompts, and it gives me the chance to explain the purpose of the frame to make sure they understand what they're doing and that sort of thing. The goal of this frame and of any narrative frame is to provide the people that fill it out with the context for reflective and qualitative responses. The idea here is that a narrative frame can encourage richer and more detailed responses than just a list of questionnaire items might. And in this case, because I do it as a before-after frame on the first and last day, it functions kind of as a needs analysis by telling me something about what the students are expecting from the course, as well as a course evaluation by telling me about what they thought about it after it's finished. More importantly, though, I think and hope that it functions as a record for the students, something that they can take away as kind of a story of the class. Even if they don't keep the frame itself, I hope it establishes the course in their minds as a story. All right, so if you are going to use a narrative frame in class, here are some important considerations. And these are all from Barkhuizen, but these are also things that I've come up against in my own use of narrative frames. The frame has to have a clear topic and purpose, and that means it should be clear both to you, the teacher, and also to the students. So even before you start writing the frame, you need to think about what the purpose is and what the topic is. The prompts need to be clear. That is probably fairly obvious, but if the students don't understand the prompts, they won't be able to respond to them, or they will provide responses that don't make sense. You need to think about the language that you use, both for the frame itself and the language that students use to fill it out, as well as the way that you introduce it. In my case, I have students answer questions in discussion ahead of time, and they can do that in English or Japanese. And when they fill out the narrative frame, they can use English or Japanese, even though the frame prompts are in English. And I've found that that does not create too many problems with understanding. I can read Japanese, and my sense is that the students' responses, if they're in Japanese, they still fit in with the overall flow of the frame, and I can tell whether they understand the prompts or not. A narrative frame should be about experience and reflection. That is, it should be about something that is happening to the students or has happened to them. And it should encourage them to reflect on that experience, to think about what is positive about it, what is negative, to think about what's most important, and those kinds of issues. A narrative frame should have a spatio-temporal dimension. It should be about a time and a place. Otherwise, it's not really a narrative. And related to that, it should have narrative coherence. The frame should add up to an overall story. Barkhuizen has pointed out some interesting examples of narrative frames that did not really amount to overall stories. And in those cases, they basically become another questionnaire rather than a narrative frame. So those are some important things. As I said before, you can use narrative frames for lots of different kinds of activities, not just for figuring out students' response to a methods course. Okay, so narrative frames I use in my course to get students to think about the course and to reflect on it. And the next activity, short story analysis, is something that I use to get students to think about themselves as teachers, about their future careers, and where they're going. So short story analysis means analyzing a short text for its narrative content, and this means the people and place and time of the text, This is from Clandon and Connolly, who emphasize that these are dimensions where the narrator can shift back and forth from one person to another and one place to another and so on. So these are dynamic elements of a narrative. And these content ideas are connected to 3 scales of context, and this is the innovation that Barkhuizen has introduced. Barkhuizen is the one who has developed short story analysis. The 3 scales of context start with the simplest level, story in lowercase letters, which is the immediate thoughts, feelings, and actions of the participants. So this is kind of the nuts and bolts of the story itself. And then you zoom out to the institutional settings and community settings, for example, schools or parents, teachers, administrators, and also the longer time scales, such as students' immediate career plans, their history immediately before they come into university or immediately before they start doing their practice teaching. And then the third level, story in all caps, is the socio-political level, and this might have to do with government policies, laws, national history and culture, life histories, career trajectories. So if we're talking about teachers and students who are planning to be teachers, we might be talking about MEXT guidelines, laws related to education and teaching. We might also be talking about assumptions in the culture about language learning and about language teaching and what people in general think is the best way to learn a language. We might also be talking about the life histories of the people in the story, their histories as language learners, and also their overall career trajectories, where they see themselves as going with their careers and where they hope to be in 10 years and those kinds of issues. So in my methods course, I use short story analysis in this way. I give students 3 writing assignments. The first 2 are narratives, language learning narrative and teaching narrative, and then a final reflection. And the language learning and teaching narratives are stories, and I just ask them to choose specific events in their language learning or teaching experience and to write about those events as clearly and as vividly as they can. I tell them not to worry too much about why the event is important or which one they should choose. Just choose one that they think is interesting and write about it as carefully as possible. I read their stories and write brief comments, and when I do that, I try to suggest some of the contextual issues, especially the second and third level that I talked about earlier, the institutional, community, and then the socio-political level, because those tend to be the most challenging for students to get their heads around. Then I introduce short story analysis in class by having everyone read the same text. There's an example of a text that I've used in the handout. This is Kay's story, which is an extract from an interview. And that's a good one to use because it's very short, but there are lots of sort of pregnant issues that people can dig into. And I give them questions about each of those levels of context, the 3 levels of story that I talked about earlier, and have them talk about those in groups. After they do that, and after I've sort of checked to make sure that everybody understands what this is all about, I have them read a classmate's story and then comment on the 3 levels of context in that story. Then the third writing assignment is a reflective paper where students analyze their own stories from the perspective of the 3 levels and try to reach some sort of conclusion about their identity. Okay, I'm going to finish up by talking about some important things to think about if you're going to use short story analysis in class. And I should point out that I haven't done all of this in class myself. I've had students do the first two parts of it, the two narratives, but I haven't really had them do the last one. But anyway, here are some things that I've found to be pretty important in using these kinds of activities. Short story analysis works best with stories that are limited in length and scope, which is why it's called short story analysis, obviously. If a story is too long, then it gets too unwieldy. It's really a sort of fine-grained analysis, so it works best if you have stories that are short. The analysis should be from the ground up, so it should start with the basic nuts and bolts of the story and then gradually work outwards towards the larger considerations at the second and third levels. And those second and third levels, those wider scales from story with a capital S to story in all caps, those are quite challenging, and the students really need help in getting their heads around that and thinking about that. And when you do that, if you are the teacher, you should push students to articulate their own interpretations and as much as possible avoid leading them towards your interpretations. And this is, I've found, kind of a challenging thing to do. It's very easy for me to ask questions that will guide the students towards what I think about a particular story, but that is what you should avoid. You should encourage them to come up with their own interpretations. And that final writing assignment that I mentioned earlier, the aim of that is to give the students the last word on their stories and to let them make their own conclusions. So that's all I have to say. I thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Thanks for listening.